The sun hung low over the quiet suburban streets, casting long shadows across the well-kept lawns and freshly painted mailboxes. It was a neighborhood where life seemed to move in slow motion, where people greeted each other with polite nods or quick waves from behind their steering wheels. But beneath the surface of this picturesque setting lay something less visible, a tension that had been simmering for years, waiting for a spark. The Thompsons were one of those families who had lived on Maplewood Lane since before anyone could remember. Their house stood tall at the corner of the street, its white picket fence gleaming like a symbol of stability. Mr. Thompson often boasted about how he'd helped organize the annual block party every summer since his kids were small. His wife, Mrs. Thompson, spent her afternoons tending to her rose garden, pruning each bud with meticulous care as if it were an extension of herself. To most neighbors, they seemed like pillars of the community, kind, dependable, respectable. But there were whispers, too, subtle things said behind closed doors when the topic turned to outsiders. Outsiders, as far as the Thompsons were concerned, were anyone who didn't fit neatly into their idea of what the neighborhood should look like. When the Martins arrived, the air changed almost immediately. Their moving truck rumbled down the street early one Saturday morning, drawing curious glances from behind curtains. The family stepped out with smiles so warm they seemed to defy the chilly reception they were about to receive. Marcus Martin carried boxes with ease, his broad shoulders straining slightly under the weight but never faltering. Beside him, his wife Elena directed their two children toward the front door, her voice steady and encouraging, despite the knot forming in her stomach. "This is going to be great," she said softly, more to herself than to them. "A fresh start." But fresh starts came with challenges. By Monday afternoon, Elena noticed the first sign of trouble. A flyer taped to their mailbox advertising a community meeting scheduled for later that week. The timing felt suspiciously coincidental. When she showed it to Marcus, he let out a heavy sigh, running a hand over his shaved head. "They're not even trying to hide it," he muttered, crumpling the paper in his fist. "What do you think? Should we go?" Elena hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the kitchen counter. "Maybe we should. If nothing else, just to show them we're not afraid." Across the street, Sarah Thompson watched the Martins through her bedroom window. She was 16, old enough to notice the way her parents stiffened whenever the new neighbors' names came up during dinner conversations. Her father would clear his throat and mutter something about property values, while her mother nodded along, though neither offered any concrete reason why the Martins posed a threat. Sarah couldn't understand it. From what she'd seen, the Martins looked normal, happy even. She decided to introduce herself the next day, slipping outside while her parents were busy inside. Standing awkwardly on the sidewalk, she called out, "Hi, I'm Sarah. Welcome to the neighborhood." Elena turned, surprised but pleased by the gesture. "Thank you. I'm Elena, and this is my husband Marcus." She gestured toward the man unloading tools from the back of their truck. "And these are our kids, Mia and Jordan." Sarah smiled nervously, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "So, how do you like it here so far?" Marcus chuckled dryly. "Well, we haven't been here long enough to find out yet, but it seems nice enough." There was an unspoken question lingering in his tone, one Sarah understood all too well. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her attention away. Reluctantly, she waved goodbye and headed back home, feeling torn between the warmth of the Martins and the unease radiating from her own family. Later that evening, around the Thompsons' dining table, the conversation inevitably returned to the newcomers. "I don't trust them," Mr. Thompson declared, stabbing at his steak with unnecessary force. "Did you see that truck? Practically falling apart, and those kids, they looked wild." Mrs. Thompson nodded in agreement, dabbing at her mouth with a napkin. "It's not just that. Have you noticed how many cars have slowed down to stare at their house? People are talking, Sarah. You know what happens when word gets around." Sarah pushed her mashed potatoes around her plate, her appetite suddenly gone. "Maybe they're just curious. They seem really nice." Her father scoffed. "Nice doesn't pay the bills, sweetheart. Nice doesn't keep this neighborhood safe." The words stung, but Sarah bit her tongue. She wanted to argue, to point out how hypocritical it was to judge someone based on appearances alone. Yet she knew better than to challenge her parents directly. Instead, she excused herself from the table and retreated to her room, where she sat staring at the ceiling, wrestling with conflicting emotions. Down the street, Mr. Patel leaned against his porch railing, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink. He'd lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone cared to admit, and he'd seen cycles like this play out before. Newcomers arrived, stirring up fear and suspicion among the old guard. Sometimes bridges were built, other times walls went up instead. When Sarah appeared at his doorstep the following afternoon, he wasn't entirely surprised. "Mr. Patel?" she began hesitantly. "Can I ask you something?" He smiled gently, inviting her to sit beside him. "Of course, Sarah. What's on your mind?" "It's about the Martins," she admitted, twisting her hands together. "My parents, they don't like them. They say stuff about keeping the neighborhood safe, but it feels wrong, like, why does it matter so much who lives here as long as they're good people?" Mr. Patel studied her thoughtfully, his weathered face softening. "Fear is a powerful thing, Sarah. It makes us cling to what we know, even when what we know isn't always right. Your parents aren't bad people, they're just scared, but fear can be overcome with understanding. Maybe you can help them see that." Sarah frowned, unsure if she believed him. Still, his words lingered in her mind long after she left his porch. As days passed, tensions continued to rise. Anonymous notes appeared on the Martins' doorstep, warning them to leave. A few neighbors crossed the street rather than walk past their house. Even the local grocery store clerk seemed reluctant to make eye contact with Marcus when he stopped by to pick up supplies. One evening, as Elena watered the plants lining their porch, a group of teenagers drove by, shouting insults loud enough to echo through the quiet night. She froze, gripping the hose tightly until her knuckles turned white. Inside, Marcus clenched his fists, fighting the urge to chase after them. Only the sound of Mia crying broke the spell, snapping both parents back to reality. "We can't stay here," Marcus said finally, his voice low and strained. "Not if this is what it's going to be like." Elena shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, we're not running. Not again." Their determination only grew stronger after that moment, fueled by a mix of anger and pride. They planted flowers in their yard, painted the trim of their house a cheerful shade of blue, and invited neighbors over for coffee, even if no one accepted the offer. Slowly, imperceptibly, cracks began to form in the wall of hostility surrounding them. And then there was Sarah. One rainy afternoon she knocked on the Martins' door, holding a plate of cookies she'd baked herself. "I'm sorry," she blurted out as soon as Elena answered, "for everything. My parents, they're wrong. You deserve to be here just as much as anyone else." Elena blinked, startled by the sincerity in the girl's voice. Then she smiled, opening the door wider. "Come in, Sarah. Let's talk." In that moment something shifted, not just for Sarah, but for everyone involved. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it was a start, and sometimes that was all it took to begin breaking down barriers. The Thompsons sat in their living room, the faint hum of the ceiling fan doing little to cut through the tension that filled the space. Mrs. Thompson held her teacup with trembling hands, staring into its depths as if searching for answers she couldn't quite articulate. Across from her, Mr. Thompson paced back and forth, his jaw clenched tight. "They're too nice," he muttered finally, stopping near the fireplace. "It doesn't make sense." Mrs. Thompson looked up at him, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I mean," he hesitated, running a hand over his face, "they're polite. They keep their yard tidy. They even smile when people glare at them. It's like they don't care what anyone thinks. And that makes me uncomfortable." His wife nodded slowly, though there was a flicker of unease in her eyes. She wanted to agree with him, to reinforce the beliefs they'd clung to for so long. But something about the way Marcus Martin had waved hello earlier that morning, or the way Elena had thanked her sincerely after borrowing sugar, kept gnawing at her conscience. "They're just trying to fit in," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "Maybe we should give them a chance." Mr. Thompson scoffed. "A chance? After everything we've worked for? This neighborhood is supposed to be safe, predictable. They're changing things, whether you see it or not." but deep down both of them felt the cracks forming in their carefully constructed worldview. The Martins weren't behaving the way they expected, not angry, not confrontational, not anything close to the stereotypes they'd been taught to believe. Instead, they were kind, competent, and unshakably dignified, and that unsettled them more than they cared to admit. Across the street, Marcus leaned against the kitchen counter, his arms crossed as he stared out the window. Elena stood beside him, chopping vegetables with quick, deliberate motions. Neither spoke for a moment, the weight of their shared silence heavy between them. "It's getting worse," Marcus said finally, his voice low but steady. "Every day, another note, another glare. I'm starting to think coming here was a mistake." Elena paused mid-chop, setting the knife down gently before turning to face him. "Do you remember why we came here, Marcus? For the kids. So Mia and Jordan could grow up somewhere safe where they'd have opportunities we never did." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I know, but how can I protect them if every neighbor sees us as a threat? What happens when those notes turn into something more?" Elena stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "We've faced worse. Remember Chicago? The landlord who refused to rent to us because of our names? Or Detroit when they tried to redline us out of the better schools? We survived all of that. We'll survive this too." Her words carried the weight of years spent fighting battles no one else could see. Growing up, Elena had learned early on that the world wasn't built for people like her. Her parents had worked double shifts just to afford a home in a neighborhood that still treated them like outsiders. But they'd also taught her resilience, the kind that came from knowing your worth, even when others tried to strip it away. Marcus nodded, drawing strength from her conviction. "You're right. We've always found a way, and maybe this time we can show them something different, something better." At school the next day, Mia sat alone at lunch, picking at her sandwich while whispers swirled around her. A group of girls nearby laughed loudly, their voices carrying across the cafeteria. "Did you hear? Her dad got pulled over again last week," one of them said, glancing pointedly in Mia's direction. "Guess some people just can't follow the rules." Mia's cheeks burned, but she forced herself to take a slow, steady breath. She thought about what her mom always told her. "Don't let them see you cry. That's what they want." Still, it was hard not to feel small under the weight of their stares. Just then, Sarah slid onto the bench beside her, holding a brown paper bag. "Hey," she said quietly, offering a tentative smile. "Mind if I sit here?" Mia blinked, surprised. Sure." For a few minutes, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah cleared her throat. "Look, I know my parents aren't exactly welcoming, but I wanted to say, I'm sorry. You shouldn't have to deal with all this crap just because you moved here." Mia studied her for a moment, unsure whether to trust her. Finally, she shrugged. "It's not your fault, but thanks for saying it anyway." As they talked, Sarah realized how much she didn't know about systemic racism, about microaggressions, about the invisible barriers that shaped Mia's life every single day. It made her angry, not just at her parents, but at herself for being blind to it for so long. Later that evening, Mr. Patel hosted a small gathering at his house, including a handful of neighbors, including the Thompsons. Over cups of chai, he steered the conversation toward community values, subtly challenging the prejudices simmering beneath the surface. "I've lived here longer than most of you," he began, his tone gentle but firm. "And I've seen how fear can divide us, but I've also seen how understanding can bring us together. When new families move in, they bring fresh perspectives, new ideas. Isn't that something worth celebrating?" Mrs. Thompson shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding eye contact. Beside her, Mr. Thompson frowned, clearly wrestling with conflicting thoughts. For the first time, he wondered if his resistance stemmed less from logic and more from habit, from years of believing what he'd been told without questioning it. When Sarah arrived home later that night, she found her father sitting alone in the study, staring blankly at a photo album. Inside were pictures of her as a child, playing with neighborhood kids who now barely acknowledged her existence. "Dad," she ventured cautiously, "are you okay?" He glanced up, startled. "I was just thinking about how much has changed, how much we've changed." She hesitated, then sat down beside him. "Maybe change isn't such a bad thing." He didn't respond right away, but the seed had been planted. Slowly, painfully, he began to question the beliefs he'd held for so long. Back at the Martins' house, Marcus and Elena gathered their children around the dining table, sharing stories of their own struggles and triumphs. "You know," Marcus said, looking at Mia and Jordan, "there will always be people who try to hold you back, but you don't let them define you. You stand tall, you work hard, and you prove them wrong, not for them, but for yourselves." Elena nodded, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "And remember, you're not alone. There are people who believe in you, who see your worth. Like Sarah, like Mr. Patel. Even if it feels like the whole world is against you, there's always someone willing to stand by your side." In that moment, surrounded by love and determination, the family felt a renewed sense of purpose. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but they also knew they had each other, and that was enough. Slowly, imperceptibly, the tide was beginning to turn. The air was thick with tension as the Thompsons marched across the street, their footsteps echoing on the pavement. Mr. Thompson led the way, his face flushed with anger, while Mrs. Thompson trailed behind, wringing her hands nervously. They stopped at the Martins' front door and knocked sharply, the sound reverberating through the quiet evening. Elena opened the door, her expression calm but wary. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing in front of her. Mr. Thompson didn't bother with pleasantries. "We need to talk," he said, his tone clipped. "About why you're here." Marcus appeared beside Elena, his presence grounding her. "We live here," he replied evenly, "just like you." "That's exactly the problem," Mr. Thompson exploded, his frustration spilling over. "This neighborhood has standards, expectations. You don't belong here." For a moment, silence hung heavy between them. Elena took a step forward, meeting Mr. Thompson's gaze without flinching. "And who gets to decide that?" she asked softly. "Who decides where we belong?" Mrs. Thompson shifted uncomfortably, glancing at her husband. "It's not personal," she tried to explain, though her voice wavered. "It's just, change is hard for people. They feel threatened." "Threatened by what?" Marcus interjected, his tone firm but controlled. "By the fact that we work hard, that we care about our kids, that we want the same things you do? A safe place to call home?" The words hit like a punch, forcing the Thompsons to confront the emptiness of their arguments. For the first time they saw the humanity in the family standing before them, not as stereotypes or threats, but as people with dreams and struggles just like theirs. Inside the house the confrontation continued, each word carrying the weight of years of prejudice and pain. The Thompsons' voices rose and fell, revealing cracks in their armor. Mrs. Thompson admitted how uncomfortable it made her feel when neighbors whispered about the Martins, while Mr. Thompson confessed his fear of losing control over the neighborhood he'd always seen as his own. But the Martins remained steadfast, refusing to let anger dictate their response. Instead, they spoke from a place of vulnerability and truth. "You think this is about property values or safety," Elena said, her voice trembling slightly. "But it's not. It's about fear. Fear of someone different, someone who doesn't look like you or talk like you, and that fear keeps you from seeing us for who we really are." Her words struck a nerve, leaving the Thompsons momentarily speechless. It was Mia, standing quietly in the corner, who broke the silence. "We're not trying to take anything away from you," she said softly. "We just want to be happy. Is that so wrong?" Tears welled up in Mrs. Thompson's eyes as she looked at the young girl. She thought of her own daughter, Sarah, and the innocence she once had, the innocence she feared losing in a world filled with hate. For the first time she saw herself in Elena's determined gaze and heard echoes of her own childhood fears in Mia's quiet plea. Later that night, the Thompsons returned home, their minds racing with conflicting emotions. Sitting at the kitchen table, they replayed the conversation over and over, unable to shake the feeling that they'd been wrong all along. "What if?" Mrs. Thompson began hesitantly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we've been looking at this all wrong? What if they're not the problem? It's us!" Mr. Thompson buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by the enormity of the realization. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted. "How do you undo years of believing something that isn't true?" His wife reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "Maybe we start by listening, by really hearing them instead of shutting them out. As they sat together in the dim light, the walls they'd built around themselves began to crumble, brick by painful brick. Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the neighborhood, sparking conversations that had long been avoided. Some neighbors doubled down on their prejudices, clinging to the familiar even as it unraveled before their eyes. But others, like Mr. Patel and Sarah, saw an opportunity for change. At a community meeting the following week, tensions ran high as residents gathered to discuss the growing divide. When Marcus stood up to speak, the room fell silent, every eye fixed on him. "We didn't move here to cause trouble," he began, his voice strong and clear. "We came because we believed in the promise of this neighborhood, a promise of safety, of belonging, of community. But we can't build that promise alone. It takes all of us." He paused, letting his words sink in. "You have a choice. You can keep seeing us as outsiders, as threats, or you can choose to see us as neighbors, as part of the fabric of this place. Because the truth is, we're already here, and we're not going anywhere." A murmur rippled through the crowd, some nodding in agreement while others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Then, unexpectedly, Sarah stood up. "He's right," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. "I've spent my whole life thinking this neighborhood was perfect, but it's not. Not if we turn our backs on people just because they're different. If we want to be better, if we want to do better, we have to start now." One by one, other neighbors joined in, voicing their support for the Martins. Even those who had once harbored doubts found themselves moved by the courage and authenticity of the family standing before them. In the days that followed, small acts of solidarity began to emerge. Neighbors brought over plates of food, offered to help with yard work, or simply stopped by to introduce themselves. It wasn't perfect. There were still whispers, still moments of discomfort, but progress was undeniable. For the Martins, these gestures meant more than words could express. They weren't just signs of acceptance. They were reminders of their resilience, their strength, their unshakable belief in the power of authenticity. As Marcus and Elena watched their children play outside with newfound friends, they felt a sense of peace they hadn't known was possible. The road ahead would still be challenging, but they faced it together, with hope, with purpose, and with the knowledge that they had inspired change not just in themselves but in the community around them. And somewhere deep inside, the Thompsons felt it too, a flicker of transformation, a spark of understanding that promised brighter days ahead. The Thompsons walked away from the confrontation with heavy hearts, their footsteps slow and uncertain, the weight of what had been said and left unsaid pressed down on them like a storm cloud refusing to break. Mrs. Thompson clutched her husband's arm tightly, as if seeking stability in a world that suddenly felt unsteady. "What have we done?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "All this time, we were so sure we were right." Mr. Thompson didn't respond immediately. His jaw was clenched, his eyes fixed on the ground ahead. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he muttered, "I don't know how to fix it." They reached their front porch, where Sarah sat waiting, her arms crossed over her chest. She looked up at them, her expression unreadable. "Well?" she demanded, her tone sharper than usual. "What happened?" Her parents exchanged a glance before sinking onto the steps beside her. For once, they didn't try to shield her from the truth. Mrs. Thompson sighed deeply, running a hand through her hair. "We were wrong, Sarah, about everything." Sarah blinked, startled by the admission. "So now what? Are you just going to forget about it, pretend it never happened?" "No," Mr. Thompson said firmly, surprising even himself. "No, we can't do that. We've got to start somewhere." Over the next few weeks, the Thompsons took small tentative steps toward change. They attended a community meeting hosted by Mr. Patel, who spoke passionately about the importance of empathy and understanding. At first they felt out of place, unsure of what to say or how to act. But as they listened to stories from others, stories of struggle, resilience, and hope, they began to see themselves differently. One evening, after returning home from one such meeting, Mrs. Thompson sat down at the kitchen table with a notebook. She scribbled furiously, jotting down thoughts and questions that had been swirling in her mind. When Mr. Thompson joined her, she slid the notebook toward him. "I think we need to apologize," she said quietly. Not just to the Martins, but to everyone we've hurt. It won't fix everything, but maybe it's a start." He nodded slowly, his fingers tracing the edge of the page. "And then what? How do we make sure we don't go back to the way things were?" "We keep learning," she replied. "We listen, we stay open." It wasn't easy, far from it. There were moments when old habits crept back in, when fear or frustration threatened to derail their progress, but each time they reminded themselves why they'd started this journey in the first place, because staying silent wasn't an option anymore. Meanwhile, the Martins continued to inspire those around them with their unwavering strength and determination. Marcus organized a neighborhood cleanup day, inviting everyone to participate regardless of background or belief. Elena led workshops at the local library, sharing resources and strategies for combating systemic racism. Together, they became symbols of resilience, not just for their family, but for the entire community. One afternoon, as Mia helped paint a mural on the side of the community center, she turned to her mom with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think people will ever stop being scared of us?" she asked. Elena knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Maybe not everyone," she admitted. "But every time someone chooses to see us for who we really are, it makes a difference. And that's worth fighting for." Mia nodded, her lips curving into a small smile. "Then I guess we should keep fighting." As the months passed, the ripple effects of the Martins' actions grew stronger. Neighbors who had once avoided them now sought them out, eager to learn and grow alongside them. Even those who remained skeptical found themselves challenged by the undeniable impact of the Martins' presence. At a town hall meeting, Marcus stood before a packed room, his voice steady and resolute. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said. "It takes work, from all of us. But if we commit to listening, to standing together, then we can build something better, something stronger." His words resonated deeply, sparking conversations that extended far beyond the walls of the meeting hall. People began to examine their own biases, to question the systems they had long taken for granted. Slowly but surely, the fabric of the community began to shift. For the Thompsons, the transformation was both painful and liberating. They reached out to the Martins, offering a heartfelt apology that left both families teary-eyed. Over coffee and shared meals, they began to rebuild trust, one awkward conversation at a time. It wasn't perfect, there were still moments of discomfort, but it was real. One evening, as they sat together on the Martins' porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Mr. Thompson cleared his throat. "Thank you," he said simply, "for not giving up on us." Marcus smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. "We didn't give up on ourselves," he replied, "and neither should you. In the end, it wasn't just the Thompsons or the Martins who changed. It was the entire neighborhood. Acts of kindness replaced acts of hostility, conversations replaced silence, and though challenges remained, there was a newfound sense of possibility in the air. As Sarah walked home one night, she paused beneath a street lamp, gazing up at the stars. For the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful, not just for herself, but for everyone around her. Change was hard, messy, imperfect, but it was also beautiful, and it started with a single step. She smiled to herself, then turned and headed home, ready to take whatever came next, one step at a time.